أهلا بكم معانا النهاردة في تكملة سلسلة الندوات الخاصة بالجمعية المصرية للمباني الخضراء. معاكم هدى إبراهيم، عضو مجلس إدارة بالجمعية المصرية للمباني الخضراء ومسؤولة التواصل بالجمعية. تم تأسيس الجمعية سنة 2012، وهي جمعية أهلية غير هادفة للربح، وأحد أعضاء المجلس العالمي للأبنية الخضراء. وإحنا كمجموعة من أعضاء الجمعية عندنا خبرة ومتخصصين في نظام تقييم المباني الخضراء العالمية. عملنا نظام تقييم للمباني وسميناه ترشيد. هدفنا نشر مبادئ الاستدامة بشكل مبسط، وأهمية تطبيقها وتأثيرها الإيجابي على المجتمعات، زي الجانب الاقتصادي من توفير استهلاك الكهرباء والمية، وجانب اجتماعي عن طريق إنها بتوفر بيئة داخلية صحية للمتواجدين جوه المبنى، وكمان الجانب البيئي اللي بيأثر بشكل كبير في الموارد الطبيعية والمحافظة عليها وتقليل الانبعاثات الكربون والغازات الضارة. والنهارده بنستغل الفرصة عشان نشكر شركاء النجاح، وحابين نفكر حضراتكم إن العضويات حاليا مفتوحة للشركات والمؤسسات والمطورين العقاريين اللي هنسعد جدا بوجودهم معانا. عملنا الفترة اللي فاتت 3 ندوات، تقدروا حضراتكم تشوفوا التسجيل بتاعها على قناتنا على اليوتيوب وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك. الحقيقة ضيوفنا كلهم مميزين وليهم خبرة كبيرة في مجال الاستدامة، واحنا دايما حابين نقدم كل مرة حاجة جديدة ومفيدة. عشان كده النهاردة معانا ضيفة مميزة جدا، وهي المهندسة فيكتوريا كيت، وهي Director of Advanced Net Zero في المجلس العالمي للمباني الخضراء. فيكتوريا درست العمارة والتصميم البيئي من جامعة نوتنغهام، وألفت كتاب A Whole Building Approach to High Performance، وهتكلمنا عن إزاي ننهض برؤيتنا للحياة بشكل كامل بتطبيق معايير الاستدامة. الحقيقة فيكتوريا ليها خبرة كبيرة في مجال المباني الخضراء والتنمية المستدامة، وبتشتغل على حاجة مهمة جدا، وهي إزاي نقدر نخلي كل المباني صفرية الانبعاثات والاستهلاك بحلول عام 2050. Now let me pass on to my colleague Amira Ayub to proceed our webinar in English. Hi Amira, how do you do?
Hello Huda, hello everyone. I am so excited to welcome you all today at the fourth webinar of Egypt Speaks Green Free webinar series. My name is Amira Ayub. I am one of the technical committee team at Egypt Green Building Council. Egypt Green Building Council was founded in 2012. It is non-profit and non-governmental organization. It is also a member of the World Green Building Council. Our vision is to lead community transformation for Egypt to become a beacon of sustainability and green buildings. And our goal is to help in the creation of a better quality of life by raising public awareness and improving professional practice with regard to sustainability and green buildings through our different programs. Our flagship program is Tarshid Rating System. Its goal is simple: to help the implementation of environmental, social, and economical savings of energy, water, and material resources, at the same time improving the quality of life in building. We would like to thank all our corporate members, and if you're interested in corporate membership, please send us an email at info@egyptgbc.org. You can also find the recording of all our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. Now it's time to introduce our speaker, so I will pass this on to Shireen. Hello, Shireen.
Hello, Amira, and thank you very much, and thank you also, Huda. Once again, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar of the Egypt Green Building Council. My name is Shireen Fahmy, and I am co-founder of EgyptGBC, as well as member of the board of directors and treasurer. I will be in charge of coordinating our discussion tonight. As we all know, EgyptGBC is a member of the World Green Building Council, WorldGBC. Now, the mission of WorldGBC is to transform the building and construction sector across areas such as climate action, health, and well-being. WorldGBC are a global action network comprised of around 70 green building councils around the globe. The mission of WorldGBC relating to combating climate change brings us to the concept of net zero. A net zero carbon building is a building that is highly energy efficient and fully powered from on-site and or off-site renewable energy sources. Advancing net zero is WorldGBC's pioneering global project working to ensure that all buildings are net zero carbon by the year 2050, leading the industry towards a net zero carbon, healthy and resilient built environment. I am very happy tonight to be introducing WorldGBC Director of Advancing Net Zero, Victoria Kate Burrows, to talk with us about advancing a whole life vision. In her role as Director for Advancing Net Zero, Victoria oversees and supports green building councils participating in the Net Zero project, as well as a number of other partnerships which provide funding and support, marketing and communication, and net zero carbon buildings commitment. Victoria brings a unique perspective to the Advancing Net Zero project, with a strong background in the sustainable development industry, ranging from client-side advisory services, green building rating tool consultancy, and an on-site head of sustainability for a major international contractor. She has a degree in architecture and environmental design from the University of Nottingham, and she has also co-authored the book, A Whole System Approach to High Performance. And the last couple of things before we begin, just some quick notes. First, as always, we love hearing from you and we welcome all questions. Please write any questions you may have in the question box, whether in English or in Arabic. I will then hopefully put as many of these questions forward to Victoria at the Q&A session as we near the end of the webinar. Second and last note, and as Huda and Amira have already mentioned, a recording of this session will be found on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel. Now, for those who are still joining us now, welcome to our webinar titled A Whole Life Vision with Victoria Burrows, Director, Advancing Net Zero, World Green Building Council. Now, let me now turn the time over to Victoria. Welcome, Victoria.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this session. I'm really pleased. Thank you so much, Shireen, for the introduction. You've heard so much about myself and the World Green Building Council and the Advancing Net Zero project, but I'm delighted to have the time today to share with you in a bit more depth what we're seeing around the world from green building councils on our mission to advance a net zero whole life vision. So as already briefly mentioned, the World Green Building Council is a network of around 70 green building councils across the world, transforming the building and construction sector across 3 strategic impact areas: climate action, health and well-being, and resources and circularity. And that's because the building and construction movement has a huge responsibility to drive and meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they actually, as shown through this graphic, can help us achieve several particular goals, from improving health and well-being to water and infrastructure, biodiversity, but also producing fewer emissions and helping us towards a net zero future. And so the World Green Building Council established the Advancing Net Zero project in reaction to the Paris Agreement being set at COP21 in 2015, because we recognized the need for the building and construction sector to take responsibility for the enormous amounts of energy consumption and carbon emissions and resource consumption in materials and water and all sorts of other sustainability impacts. So, as mentioned already, our campaign is to accelerate the uptake of net zero carbon buildings to 100% by 2050. And the project aims to increase awareness and education of the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings to achieve alignment and commonality between all the different Green Building Council approaches and certification schemes, and also to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing leadership examples at events such as the one you're having here today. So we have a whole life carbon vision that combines the concepts of net zero operational carbon and net zero embodied carbon. So operational carbon being the carbon emissions associated with the use phase of a building's life cycle. So the energy that goes to heat and cool and power and light buildings. And then embodied carbon, the emissions associated with materials and construction all through the building's life cycle, but particularly when a building or infrastructure project is first built. So by 2050, our vision is that new buildings, infrastructure, and renovations will have net zero embodied carbon, and that all buildings, including existing buildings, are operating at net zero operational carbon. And this is becoming less of a vision and more of an obligation of the building and construction sector to take responsibility for all those emissions and the life cycle of building projects. Because between now and 2050, we expect to double the world's building stock. And that's a huge amount of new buildings, but that also means that half of the buildings that will be standing in the mid-century are already built. So we also have to deal with the emissions and the efficiency from existing buildings as well. So from 2030, we want new buildings, infrastructure, and renovations to have at least 40% less embodied carbon with a significant upfront carbon reduction. And all new buildings must be net zero operational carbon. And of course, there's an increased amount of influence that you can have on a new project in the way that it's designed and the material selection, and of course, its overall performance. But 2030 is just now 9 short years away. And so for projects that take several years to develop, that's just around the corner. And so we have a net zero carbon buildings commitment, which I'll come on to in a little later, which helps promote leadership towards activating the solutions we need to achieve this vision. So let's start with net zero operational carbon. Our definition, as already outlined, is a net zero carbon building is highly efficient, energy efficient, with all remaining energy from on-site and or off-site renewable sources. And we have a series of guiding principles here that help encourage best practice application of that definition. So firstly, we're talking about measuring and disclosing actual carbon from the in-use of the building. So looking at the energy consumption based on metered data and understanding not just how much energy is being consumed, but where that energy is coming from and the energy and fuel sources, and therefore the carbon emissions associated with it. So is it from fossil fuels or from renewable energy? Secondly, to reduce energy demand through energy efficiency measures, reducing energy wastage, making our homes and schools and offices more comfortable. But that'll also mean that we can reach decarbonisation faster by drastically reducing the energy demand. The third principle is to generate the balance from renewable energy. So on-site where possible, but also from off-site locations. And as a final resort, offsetting any carbon emissions left over. And then also improving verification and rigor. We've started with operational carbon. We've now expanded our scope into embodied carbon, but also considering those other sustainability impacts that I mentioned earlier, like water and waste and material selection. So next, onto net zero embodied carbon. A net zero embodied carbon building, new or renovated, or infrastructure asset is highly resource efficient with upfront carbon minimized to the greatest extent possible, and all remaining embodied carbon reduced or as a last resort offset in order to achieve net zero across the life cycle. So you'll see from that definition, again, the focus is really on reducing our consumption before addressing those emissions. And so the guiding principle is, first of all, prevent emissions in the first place. Do we have to build new buildings, or can we extend the life of existing buildings by renovating existing ones and bringing them into the current standards? Secondly, reduce and optimize. So think about recycled content of materials, the location of the production, the manufacturing processes, the transport involved, and optimize those emissions that are being used to generate that new asset. The third principle is to plan for the future. So think about how a building can be adapted over time and make sure that it's future-proofed for different uses over its entire life cycle of 60 or more years. And also think about how the building can be designed for deconstruction or disassembly, so that it's not the only option left is to demolish a building. And that will help optimize materials for circular economy as well. And then finally, once again, to offset any residual emissions, which will inevitably occur as part of the embodied carbon balance process. But following that principles hierarchy should mean that we've reduced our emissions significantly already. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on definitions here, because we use some of these terms interchangeably across this presentation, and also when we're talking about net zero buildings and what that actually means. So we'll start with a baseline, and this would be the expected energy consumption of a building if it was built to typical code regulations, with no sort of additional measures for energy efficiency. That gives us our baseline. If you're able to implement additional energy efficiency measures beyond those requirements, then that building will have a reduced energy demand for consumption, and it's an energy efficient building. If that reduced energy demand is met by some on-site renewable energy, such as solar photovoltaic panels, then that building can be nearly zero energy, because it's nearly met all of its needs through renewable energy, but maybe it still has to be topped up by energy from the grid, which could have a fossil fuel base. If you're able to supply 100% of annual energy demand through on-site renewable energy, then that means the building is net zero energy. And if it can generate more than 100% of what it needs on-site, then it's energy positive. And in some cases, that energy can be exported back to the grid through credits or a feed-in tariff system, or even distributed to surrounding buildings. However, we also know that not all buildings in the world, due to their size, their shape, their structure, and their location, based on their climate, can generate all of your energy needs on site. And therefore, we feel that it's a more appropriate target to be looking at net zero carbon. So yes, your energy reduction, yes, generate on site where you can, but where you can't, meet all of those demands from on site to use off-site generated renewable energy through measures such as renewable energy certificates, power purchase agreements, or even switching to a green energy supplier. And then, as I said, if you can't achieve a balance of net zero, having taken all of those measures, offsets are the last option. But it really kind of gives you a sense of the journey that you need to take in order to understand what strategy is appropriate for net zero for your particular project, and whether actually preparing for a net zero future with net zero ready, so ensuring that the building is prepared for a decarbonized grid in the future, so it may not achieve net zero today, but it can in the future, might be the most appropriate strategies for different types of buildings. So around the world, green building councils are busy developing lots of different certification programs, tools, education programs, and lots of resources to help their members like you develop their capacity to deliver the net zero buildings we're looking for, and help refine what that definition means for net zero buildings in their particular market. And in some cases, that will mean focusing just on operational carbon and energy so far. So the systems in Brazil, for example, on zero energy, in India for zero energy, but actually does allow for off-site energy generation, focuses on that operational phase of the building's life cycle. But there are some programs, such as in Canada or in the UK or in some other countries in Europe, that are taking that whole life carbon approach and are asking projects to identify the emissions associated with embodied carbon as well. And then there's other examples, such as in Singapore, a super low energy approach where it's simply impossible to ensure that all energy needs are generated on site due to the high density and lack of space. And so the approach there is to head for super low energy buildings, very efficient in terms of performance, again, in anticipation for a future decarbonized grid within Singapore context. And then more closer to home, we've got programs in the Emirates with a partnership with the International Living Future Institute to offer zero energy and zero carbon certification across the Emirates. And also within South Africa, there's a carbon positive. You can achieve ratings for your buildings based on net zero and positive carbon impacts, water, waste, and ecological value as well. So you can see that all of these different green building councils are applying those principles that I mentioned. They are all driving towards net zero, but they're doing so in a way that's appropriate for the conditions and the context of their particular market. And that does mean in some cases allowing the use of offsets, in some cases not allowing the use of offsets. And again, this is all really important because all of the Green Building Council certification tools and programs promote a level of performance that sits above the current regulations for that particular market. And of course, regulations completely vary from country to country and sometimes even state to state within different countries. And so these tools and the commitment, which I'll come on to in a second, represent examples of what we call ambition loops, which help to support bolder climate action from businesses and governments. And the idea is that governments need to see early adoption of ambitious action from businesses in order to create the confidence in them to set clear and ambitious targets and policy that the industry is ready to deliver against those targets. And then that will help create more investment and growth strategies from business because they can see the direction of travel for policy. And then that will encourage more bolder and ambitious regulations from governments, such as incentives and helping to provide those regulatory frameworks for a full transition to a zero carbon economy. And then that brings those solutions into the mainstream because everyone has to do it. And so the demand loop is also being created and the supply as well of those solutions. So it's really important that we're able to demonstrate and showcase early business climate action leadership so that the policy will come, and it is coming, the policy is following, but also that we're preparing and enabling industry to deliver against those high performance targets as well. So the good news is that net zero is here. These are a couple of case studies of examples in the images here, and I'm going to go through a couple of extra case studies as well. But it gives us hope that we can achieve net zero with the technological equipment that is available to us today. And we're seeing it across the world in lots of different applications. So the top left image there is mosques in Jordan that are achieving net zero through a public procurement program. The top right there is Barangaroo, which is a huge mixed use, high density development in Sydney, right on the harbour, that uses a cooling system from the harbour, is highly energy efficient as much as it can be, has some on-site solar panels, but of course those towers are very tall and it can't generate all of the energy it needs on site. So it pulls in energy from renewable energy from off-site locations outside of Sydney. The bottom right there is MENA Stadium in Brazil, which has all of those solar panels retrofit onto the roof structure of the existing building. And it actually only needs 10% of what it generates annually. And the rest of the energy is distributed to around 200 homes in the vicinity. And then the bottom left is affordable housing in Hawaii that managed to achieve 40% emission or energy reductions just through more efficient techniques for construction, and then meets its remaining energy demand through on-site solar, both solar thermal and solar electricity, and meaning that from an affordable housing standpoint, then they bring lots of social benefits as well and are affordable to deliver. So a few more case studies to share with you. This is the Phoenix office, which is actually a refurbishment office in Montreal in Canada, an existing building that was refurbished to net zero standards by an architecture firm called LeMay. And this actually resulted in a carbon footprint that was 86% lower than if they had designed and constructed a new building. And that's, of course, because so much of the carbon emissions are associated with the new materials for construction. And actually, so many of those carbon emissions are already locked in to those materials that are already built the first time around. And so it's extended the lifetime of that building to renovate it instead of building new with the new materials that would have involved. The second case study I have for you is from the National University of Singapore. So demonstrating that actually net zero can be achieved in quite a large building, quite an energy intensive building, and also in a tropical climate. And in this case, an integral aspect of achieving net zero energy consumption is that conventional approaches to air conditioning have to be challenged. In fact, entirely conventional approaches to design had to be challenged. All the circulation spaces are outside of the conditioned space, for example, and really kind of taking consideration into how to drive those efficiencies through the space. The next one is a school. This is Discovery Elemental School in Virginia in the United States. And in this case, it's really neat because the children can see a building energy dashboard and they can start to understand the relationship between the weather and energy generation and energy consumption as well. And really the impacts and effects of them turning on lights or using energy through their computers. And so it's really interesting to be able to see that visually and help make the connection between the climate and the energy that we're consuming. And then I think this is the final one. And this is a green business center for Godrej in Hyderabad in India. And this is a really interesting one because it really has had to consider thoughtful integration of passive and active measures in order to achieve net zero. This is a concept of energy budgeting, if you like, the consideration of how much energy can be generated from the space associated with the footprint of that building, and understanding how much energy can be created in a year or generated on site in a year, and then optimizing the design with passive measures and making sure to maximize passive ventilation and natural daylight, and really drive down the energy consumption to make sure that annually the energy consumption fits within that generation budget. And that's why you can see every square inch of the roof has been maximized in terms of what it can generate for its solar capacity. Now, the good news, as I said, is that those buildings are here, the solutions are here, the technology is here. We now need to ramp up our ambition and our action. We need to take these solutions to scale. And so in 2018, the World Green Building Council launched the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment. It is an initiative that helps drive those solutions for net zero buildings across entire portfolios, entire cities and states and regions. We have 114 signatories with some more to be announced next week. And there's a detailed guidance document that's available on our website with a whole information pack if you're interested. We leverage the work of the Green Building Council network and its rating tools to help demonstrate your actions towards energy efficient and net zero buildings. And each signatory produces an action plan, which I'll come on to in a second, and sets out what the actions are going to be under that commitment and what you intend to do to achieve that net zero goal. I'll show you a couple of examples in a second. So there are 5 components to the commitment. The first is to commit. And what we ask is that you commit to an advanced trajectory for all new and existing buildings within direct control of the organization to operate at net zero carbon by 2030. So that's bringing that target date forward by 20 years and saying that all buildings, including existing, will operate within net zero by 2030. For cities, states and regions, we ask for them to regulate for all buildings to operate at net zero by 2050 and all new buildings by 2030. So putting that vision into actual regulation in their jurisdictions, in their cities or their states and regions. The second component is disclose. So disclose and assess the annual asset and portfolio energy demand and carbon emissions associated with your buildings. Thirdly, to take that information and develop a decarbonisation roadmap and reduce emissions through key actions and milestones towards energy efficiency and renewable energy, and then report on that progress every year. Demonstrate that you're achieving enhanced energy performance and reduced carbon emissions and the progress you're making towards your net zero assets and portfolio, and have that data verified by a third party. And then finally, advocate for wider emission reductions by acting as a catalyst through core organization activities for more action within your respective supply chains, and make sure that you yourselves are an enabler to others achieving their own net zero goals. The detailed guidance that's on our website sets out everything you need to know if you're interested in signing up, and helps explain some of the approaches that need to be taken towards things like greenhouse gas accounting, what the sorts of energy efficiency measures that we look for, how to go about third-party certification and verification, and lots more. It's all there on our website. So here's an example of a signatories action plan in their profile. This is AESG, a specialist consultancy firm actually based in the Emirates and have offices in London, but actually are active in more than 15 countries as an engineering firm. And they commit that by 2030, they will ensure their own assets are achieving net zero. And in fact, they've set themselves an advanced target for net zero scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2021. Then they go through in the action plan how they intend to disclose their information through their annual sustainability reports, the sorts of actions they're going to take, including a 5% annual reduction in their emissions. And then also verify through the use of tools like LEED to show at a building level how they're achieving their targets. But as designers, that's where their greatest impact is. And so they will provide a pathway for net zero for all their design projects, for all of their clients, to help demonstrate how net zero can be achieved on all the different projects that they work on. This is Majid Al Fattah, which some of you will know. I think I spotted their logo as a member of Egypt Green Building Council, so that's fantastic, and a really active member of the advancing of the net zero carbon buildings commitment, because they already have established a net positive strategy. And so they were a founding signatory of the commitment because they've already committed to eliminating operational carbon emissions from all their own occupied and operated spaces by 2030. And then in addition to that, and all the effort that involves, driving emission reductions through every aspect of their business, through the malls they operate, through things like green energy leases, and also ensuring that they're working with their suppliers to improve the efficiency of their own assets as well. And then also at a city level, we have cities like Tokyo, with more than 13.5 million inhabitants, committing through the C40 Cities Net Zero Carbon Buildings Declaration to ensure that they will regulate within their regulation and code frameworks for net zero new buildings from 2030, and all buildings to be net zero in that city by 2050. And this profile sets out what they've already implemented, which is helping them towards that goal, and also some of the actions that they intend to do, such as developing a schedule of actions for each building program to work towards achieving the goal of zero emissions Tokyo. So if you're interested in joining the commitment, please contact Egypt Green Building Council or ourselves at World Green Building Council, and we will work with you along your net zero journey and determine your alignment with the requirements of the commitment, if there's anything that you need to do to adjust the actions of your organization, and set that goal for yourselves to achieve net zero across your portfolio and what that means for you and your organization. And there's a really kind of lengthy recruitment process, so it allows lots of time for you to fully understand what it means for you. And we encourage you to join this growing community of businesses, organizations, cities, states, and regions that are committing to make a zero emissions built environment a reality. Now, I've spoken a lot about operational emissions so far, and currently the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment focuses just on operational carbon emissions, but we are developing a whole life carbon pathway that helps bring in actions to reduce embodied carbon as well. So building operations are responsible for 28% of energy-related carbon emissions globally. So it's a huge chunk of emissions, and that's the energy for the use phase of the buildings, and it completely dwarfs other industries because we are also responsible for 11% associated with the construction industry, with the materials and construction processes in building and maintaining our buildings. Those operations are broken into both residential and commercial sectors, and it's accounted for both direct and indirect emissions. So that's direct combustion on site through on-site combustion technologies, but also the amount of energy that comes from the grid, so indirect emissions from using grids that are fueled by fossil fuels. But in addition to this, the concrete, steel, and aluminium sectors are responsible for 22.7% of global emissions because, of course, they supply other industries as well as the building and construction sector. Concrete alone, 11.1%, steel, 10.1%, and then aluminium, 1.5%. And so you can really tell here how we, as the building and construction sector, have a really crucial role to play in creating the demand for low carbon alternatives to materials such as concrete, steel, and aluminium, but also all across the materials value chain and supply chains to ensure that there are lower carbon options for us as a sector. And if we can generate and create that additional demand, then that would mean that those supply industries have the confidence through the ambition loops again to make the investments necessary to bring down the emissions associated with those heavy industries. And that would mean that by doing that, because they're responsible for so much more in terms of emissions and because of serving other industries, we can have a far greater impact than just the enormous already 39% that our sector is responsible for. And so last year, the World Green Building Council launched Bringing Embodied Carbon Upfront, which is a report all about addressing embodied emissions from a building's life cycle. This is an image, a graphic from that report that shows the project life cycle, that shows the gray sector. So the circle all the way around the outside refers to embodied carbon. So that's carbon emissions associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building or infrastructure project. So sometimes embodied carbon is considered just those emissions at the very beginning of a project before it starts to be used, but actually embodied carbon occurs all the way through the building life cycle. Upfront carbon is the emissions caused in the materials production and construction phases of the life cycle before the building or infrastructure begins to be used. And then there's embodied carbon that occurs in the use stage of a building, required for the upkeep of those built assets, for renovation, for maintenance. Then there's end of life carbon, the carbon emitted during demolition or deconstruction and the processing of materials for reuse or recycling or disposal. And then there's emissions even beyond the life cycle where they're being reused within different assets. And so embodied carbon occurs all the way through the life cycle. And that's why we have a heavy focus on the upfront carbon emissions. That's where there's the greatest influence to be made in reducing those emissions, but also we must consider it across the entire life cycle. And therefore, the opportunities to reduce embodied carbon are much higher right at the beginning of a new project in the planning stages. Of course, we could build nothing and explore alternatives, as I mentioned already, through renovating existing buildings. We could build a lot less, maximizing the use of existing assets, but also looking at things like lean construction, building cleverly, optimizing material usage and design with low carbon materials, building super efficiently through the construction phase using low carbon construction technologies and techniques such as offsite manufactured construction, and also eliminating the amount of waste associated with the construction phase. And while there is a lot of embodied carbon during the operation and maintenance, the really big opportunity to reduce embodied carbon is right at the beginning of those projects. And so we encourage you to evaluate every design project that you work on for the opportunities to reduce embodied carbon. Within the report, we set out a series of actions that can be taken right across the value chain. This is not a challenge that can be achieved by one stakeholder across the value chain. And it's the shared responsibility of everyone associated with the building and construction sector to make choices and actions that will help us reach that decarbonisation goal. And so we set out within the report for each stakeholder a series of different actions that can be taken right now, but also within the next 5 years, thinking about those roadmaps and actions that you can be taking. Things like materials manufacturers having environmental performance declarations for all their products, investors sort of attaching criteria to their lending, policymakers setting targets within regulatory framework, for example. And so this really sets out the sorts of actions that need to be taken by the mainstream actors, by everyone across the world, in order to ensure that all the different barriers are overcome and unlocked, and we can really reach the potential of the sector by achieving that decarbonisation goal. Our theory of change To achieve this vision is firstly collaboration. We need to be working towards a common vision and establishing those roadmaps so that everyone can identify the role they play in achieving this vision. Communication to raise awareness and build capacity, increased education to address foundational gaps in skills and data and the benchmarks that we need to be setting. Innovative new business models, new technologies, more circular patterns of working, and also regulation to mandate those reductions in operational and embodied carbon that are aligned with a 1.5 degree compliant decarbonisation pathway. And all of those components together will help us harness the power of voluntary, financial, policy and regulatory market forces and accelerate the transition to net zero. So finally, some global trends. We're certainly seeing a huge influx of tools and resources that are helping us make decisions for lower carbon alternatives for the way buildings are designed, the material choices that are made. You have different software that you can bring into a design team and make real-time decisions or make changes and see in real time the impact of design changes on the building performance or what the effect would be on the carbon budget of a project if you selected a different material or built it in a slightly different way. Energy and carbon budgeting, as I mentioned, which is becoming just as important, if not more important sometimes than the financial budget of a project, thinking about how much energy, how much of our energy budget will be consumed by specifying this particular piece of equipment, how much of our carbon budget will be consumed by specifying this particular material. Collaboration and integration, as I've mentioned, is super important for us to achieve that common vision and goal because everything is based on performance-based metrics. And so everybody needs to be bought in and working towards that common goal. Then bespoke roadmaps. Unfortunately, I'm here to tell you that there is no one single solution for net zero in all buildings in all corners of the world. And so net zero can take many forms. All of the commitment signatories that we have slightly different action plans and roadmaps. All of those case studies I shared with you have a different combination of technologies and solutions, but they all work towards the same principles that I mentioned earlier to ensure that they are a high performance building. We encourage people to commit to action, to taking these principles forward in your businesses and understanding what net zero means for you and considering the broader value proposition. So not just the financial component of net zero, and achieving some of these performance standards in some markets carries a premium. In other markets, it can be done completely cost neutrally. So it's really about the approach that's taken to net zero. It certainly doesn't need to be a very expensive approach to building and design. But also when you consider the broader value proposition about things like health and well-being, our carbon impacts and carbon emissions, if you take the whole life cycle and you're conducting life cycle analysis, then that case becomes a lot stronger. And particularly when you start to factor in things like risk mitigation for the future, the value proposition of net zero gets stronger and stronger. You can find some more stories and case studies in our Advancing Net Zero Status Report 2020, which is on our website. And I really look forward to featuring some case studies and stories from Egypt in the future iterations of this report. We've just started planning our report for next year. So thank you so much for taking the time today to listen to me. And I hope I've been able to share a little bit about this huge challenge that we as a sector are facing. But we feel that we can overcome by working together towards that common vision of decarbonisation of the built environment. So thank you so much, everyone. My contact details are here. If you have any questions or through the Egypt Green Building Council, please feel free to reach out. I think we have some time for questions, but I just wonder if you'd like me to talk about the next session now, or should we wait until we've been through the questions?
First, thank you so much, Victoria. Great stuff. That was absolutely fantastic. I think we should go ahead and take a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, great. We have some?
Yeah, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
And for everyone out there, just a reminder, please be sure to continue typing your questions into the question box, and I'll try and put through as many as I can.
Okay.
So let's start with, we have Huda asking, how do we implement the net zero concept with new buildings when it comes to do with materials?
When it comes to do with?
Materials. The area of,
Okay.
resources, yeah.
Sure. So yeah, I'm glad that we've gone straight into the embodied carbon aspect of this, because often it's something that's so easily overlooked, and you can design a very highly efficient, high performance building, but sort of not pay a close enough consideration to the embodied carbon. So as we've set out within the vision, achieving net zero embodied carbon is a sort of future, is a future vision, is a future goal, because the reality is that the supply chain really isn't geared up yet to supply us with low carbon materials that will allow every building in the world, in every location, every market, to achieve net zero embodied carbon. And so the power of sort of having events like this and setting out those visions is about creating that ambition loop, setting the confidence to ensure those investments in the future, so that we can have more and more materials that will help us achieve net zero embodied carbon within countries like Egypt and all over the world. But if you were to try and achieve a net zero embodied carbon project today, then it really would be a case that looking at the different material alternatives, it probably would sort of encourage you to go down more of a natural based solution rather than possibly steel or concrete. Whilst the steel and concrete sectors have roadmaps for decarbonisation that they're working on, so it certainly shouldn't be ruled out. It's on its way, but it does take a long time to change those industries in terms of the way that those materials are produced. So for today's purposes, it's probably sort of looking at a more kind of timber-based solution or other natural materials to make sure that the carbon is sequestered and the carbon emissions associated with that project are captured within the materials rather than released.
All right. Yep. Thanks for that. And Noha is asking, what are the software programs and tools that may help us in achieving net zero carbon in buildings in the Middle East?
Okay, so there's a few different tools that are available. Again, depending on whether your focus is on embodied carbon or on operational carbon. But if I start probably with operational carbon, there's actually lots of different tools that are out there, and we can send through a list, if you like, that can be shared with the different groups, with the people that are participating, that can help you in addition to the design software you might be using, or as plugins to things like AutoCAD, that you can have plugins that literally help calculate the carbon emissions and the predicted energy consumption of buildings as you're making changes within the architectural software, which is as an architecture student, it's fascinating for me. It's certainly a huge change since I was at architecture school. But there's even sort of much simpler models that kind of use the basis of SketchUp massing models. So I think SketchUp is free, or certainly low cost way of doing it. But again, you can apply plugins to that, and that can help you at a really early stage.
So the question was, when it comes to developing countries like ours here, what are some of the methods that you think can be taken to accelerate this transformation?
Okay, what a great question. So this is no small feat. And again, having spent time within the sector, I understand how huge this task is that we're asking the building and construction sector to take on. But as I say, there's lots of different tools and techniques out there that can really help enable this transition, and are helping make it a little bit easier, because it's certainly an industry that has is a challenge to change, because there's so many different stakeholders involved. And I think one of the simplest things that can really shift a design project or any sort of design or infrastructure or renovation project is setting a performance target. It might sound a really simple thing to do. But as soon as you set a target, or you could have an energy use intensity target of 1 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year, or you could have an improvement against the baseline code, whatever the requirement is within your nation. And if the idea is that if everyone on the design and project team is working towards that same goal, then the solutions will manifest themselves. And often they are incredibly simple. It's really optimizing that passive strategy to reduce the energy consumption, using the most efficient equipment possible that you can, within reason, within the same cost budget of the project, achieve, and think about over time how you can upgrade those systems to be as more and more efficient as more technology becomes available. And I think taking the approach of designing for performance, but designing for net zero ready, if net zero is not currently a sort of technological and financially feasible and viable target within your market, think about the future performance of those buildings. Think about electrifying the buildings. Think about building measures to decarbonize grids. So how can you optimize thermal mass and energy storage? And how can you really prepare that building for a net zero future, even if it can't be net zero today? I think it's very much about an attitude shift. It's about sort of thinking about what we can achieve. And I think there's a huge amount of power in asking your design teams why you're choosing to do something in a certain way and choosing not to do it in another way. So why are we choosing to connect this building to gas or to diesel? And, are we prepared to do that, or is there a different way of doing it? It's constantly questioning that design process.
Great. And because you just mentioned the design process, that really ties into the last question I want to put through, just for the sake of time. But here's a good one. And Huda is asking, what if projects did not implement green features before? On the onset, I guess. Her question is, how can these projects implement net zero carbon in the future?
Yeah, again, another excellent question. And I think, we're not sort of trying to push industry in down one particular route that means that green buildings will always be more expensive, or net zero buildings will always be more expensive. And I think a future-proofing strategy will always ensure that a project is prepared for that net zero future. So that's great. But there is a huge challenge in addressing the performance and the efficiency or lack of efficiency in existing buildings that haven't been designed that way. And we've inherited a huge amount of buildings that we now have to renovate and restore, like what we're doing here in France. And it certainly is a challenge. But in some cases, it again really goes back to understanding the way the building performs, making sure that you have the metered data and you can identify where improvements can be made, making improvements to things like the building fabric, but really understanding where those energy wastages might be occurring and where the efficiencies can be made.
Okay, that was absolutely fantastic. And I think we've covered a nice, good chunk of the questions presented. Thank you so much, Victoria. And is there anything else you would like to cover before a wrap up?
I wasn't expecting that. I think one thing really to say is that we're involved quite heavily in the process of trying to get buildings and the role that buildings can play really well positioned within the COP26 process. So COP26, which is of course happening next year now, but actually next week is the 5-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement happening, the Paris-versary as it's known. And so we're doing a lot to help position buildings and construction sector as a solution to climate change. Yes, it's a huge contributor at the moment, but we strongly believe that it can be shifted to a more sustainable approach to the building and construction sector, which means we have sustainable buildings for everyone everywhere, that we have that healthy, resilient, zero carbon built environment that we mentioned earlier, and all the benefits that that will help bring society, to our planets, to our communities, to our economy. And we really, truly, genuinely believe that that will happen. And so we are advocating for bolder and more ambitious regulation from governments. And we are representing industry by saying that the solutions are here and we're ready to deliver them. So please be prepared for regulation in the future, because it is coming. And we're here to help you through that process.
We're all looking forward to that, Victoria. And from all of us, we all thank you so much for a really, really interesting session. It's been a pleasure for all of us. Thank you.
My pleasure too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And to everyone out there, our next webinar will be, as always, on the first Tuesday of the new month. And the next time will be January 5th of the new year. Our guest will be Lama El Hatou, and she is an environmental specialist at the International Finance Corporate IFC part of the World Bank Group. And she will be talking about sustainability and COVID-19. We are all looking forward to that and looking forward to having you all with us. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and we will see you next time. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.